Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Metrics Matter. My name's Philip Smith, I'm the Head of News and Content at Gorkana and I'll be your moderator today. Today's webinar is the first of a three-part series which will take a look at the importance of measurement in PR and communications and show that measurement is crucial if you are to prove success in your work. Across all three webinars, which Gorkana is holding over the next few weeks, you'll be able to hear why and how you can set up an analysis and measurement program which will give you insights into the success of your campaigns and your PR activity. Measurement is very much on our mind at Gorkana, but it's particularly the case at the moment as we are in the run-up to this year's Amex Summit in June in London. So, after today's webinar, which looks at this and will take us through insights and the growth of analysis in PR, how to overcome the barriers to adoption some businesses face, and what the analysis process itself involves, we will be running the second webinar on June the 1st, and the third and final webinar in this series on the 8th of June. The second webinar will look at measurement best practice and successful case studies from the Stroke Association and more. The third and final webinar in the series will examine how ROI can be shown and how you can prove that successful PR has a positive business impact. Slides and presentations will be available from each webinar, but Gorkana will also be wrapping up the whole story in a special white paper, or ebook if you prefer, which you can sign up for as well. That will be published after the final webinar in the series, in time for AMEC. In each of the three webinars, though, I'm delighted to say that we'll be joined by Paul Hender, Gorkana's Head of Insight. Paul is responsible for developing best practice insight services, training Gorkana's analysis teams, and designing analysis programs for Gorkana's enterprise customers. Today, Paul's going to be looking at why more and more businesses are investing in analysis and generating insights. He's going to be looking at the main principles of measurement. And also he's going to be looking at the barriers agencies and businesses face when implementing analysis programs and how to overcome them. He will also look at frameworks for effective measurement processes. I'm going to hand over to Paul for his presentation in a moment, but we will also, both of us will make sure there is time for your questions afterwards. So using the question box on your screen, please do remember to send us your thoughts and questions, and I'll pose as many of them as we've got time for to Paul, and you can help me put him on the spot. Anyway, I think that's more than enough from me. Paul, welcome to the webinar. I shall now put everything over in your hands.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you for that introduction. Very kind. Welcome, everyone. As Philip said, the first of a three-part webinar series looking at analysis best practice. Wanted to do a quick plug first, because as Philip says, we're producing this webinar series in the run-up to the Amex Summit, which is the biggest conference on communications measurement, and it's taking place in our hometown of London on the 15th and 16th of June. Those that want to count, that's 21 days and 10 hours away. AMEC, who are they? AMEC is the Association for the Measurement and Evaluation of Communication. It's the trade body responsible for setting standards on best practice in communications analysis and in educating and promoting those standards to the communications industry. We're looking forward to this year's summit. We're expecting it to be the largest yet, with hundreds of delegates from all parts of the world, from PR services companies, PR agencies, in-house teams from global companies to major government organizations. So far, we have more than 50 speakers at the summit, including senior communicators from organizations such as Microsoft, Visa, UNICEF, Hilton Hotels, Diageo, and SAP. If you want more information, please visit the summit website, which you can see here. That's amecinternationalsummit.org. The theme of the summit is making metrics matter, taking measurement mainstream. And over the course of this webinar series, I want to explore this point. When I see someone struggling with measurement, the vast majority of the time is because they don't see the relevance either to themselves or to their organization. They hear the message that they should measure, but they don't always know how they should go about it, and most importantly, how they can then benefit from it. I recently got back from taking my family on a road trip around the US. We had a fantastic experience. We saw some incredible things, and luckily, unlike the Griswolds in the movie Vacation, we, including the car, all made it through in one piece. And this is inspired me to bring a road trip theme to the webinar series. So sit down, belt up, and get your cameras ready as we head off on our analysis road trip. So there are 3 stages to our tour. Today, stage 1, we'll look at why the demand in analysis is increasing and is now an essential part of a communications program. We'll also look at why there is now consensus of analysis best practice, and also why people don't invest time and money into measurement and analysis. Next week, stage 2, we'll look more at how to approach a measurement program and how to ensure that it's relevant and useful. Finally, the following week, we shall conclude with so what? So what does this really mean? So what have we learnt from doing measurement? So what is the impact on our organisation? So what is the return on our investment? So, on to stage 1. Over the next half hour, we'll look at the growth of analysis, but why there are still barriers to adoption. We'll look at best practice principles and take a look under the hood of the analysis process itself. And of course, it wouldn't be a webinar on measurement without some numbers. So here are some numbers. We've seen a significant year-on-year growth in the analysis market. The vast majority of Amex members are seeing an increase in client numbers and revenue. And there's also this strong trend from purely monitoring towards insights. So not just collecting coverage, but making sense of what it means. One of the main reasons for this trend, that in the last couple of decades, we've seen this exponential rise in the number of available media channels, from print, TV, radio, online, and social media. More channels means more potential influencers, and of course it means more content. And that means that PRs can no longer rely on their black book of journalists and the prowl of press cuttings to make sense of what is going on and what is important. There is too much. You can't see the wood for the trees. And more media has effect on the consumers of media. Us, people like us, are spending more and more time consuming the media. In the US, for example, research has shown that the average person now spends 10 hours a day in front of a screen, with access to mobile phone and tablets driving a lot of this growth. And while we might laugh at our American cousins, it's not much different here in the UK. Data from Ofcom suggests that a typical person spends half of their waking time on media and communications activity. Changes in the way that people consume media has affected the balance of marketing communications. People are becoming less tolerant of advertising, perceiving it as intrusive. Ad avoidance is seen as a significant challenge in the advertising industry. You can fast forward through ads on your set-top box, your Skybox. You can skip YouTube ads. You can use ad blocking software. And this, of course, has given an opportunity to PRs who are there to drive earned rather than paid media content. And of course, it is earned media content, the editorial, that people want to read and watch. But budgets will only go from paid towards earned if PRs can prove to marketing budget holders that it is more effective. The increasing influence of earned media is a double-edged sword. It can promote brands and enhance reputation, but it has the ability to destroy it as well. And it can do this far, and it can do it fast. Digital media doesn't respect national borders, so a media crisis can travel around the world in a matter of hours. CEOs are becoming increasingly aware of the power of media to destroy reputations, not only of their organizations, but them themselves. Just ask Martin Winterkorn of Volkswagen, who lost his job following the emissions scandal, or Nick Hayward here of BP, who didn't survive the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, or Bob Diamond, who was forced to resign when Barclays was fined an industry record £290 million for its part in fixing the interbank lending rate known as LIBOR. The latter was and still is a client of ours, and we were tracking this story as it developed on social media. It was clear to see the inflection point as negative coverage took off around lunchtime on the 27th of June and started spreading around the world. Despite the best work of the communications team, the story was too big and the damage to the organisation was significant. The chairman, chief exec, and the chief operations officer, the 3 most senior people in the company, all lost their jobs, and the value of the business collapsed by a third. A learning from these examples is that practically building reputation is the overall risk management of the business, and that means communication being front and centre in the management of an organisation rather than being the reactive press office on the periphery. This was something that the incoming CEO of Barclays, Anthony Jenkins, did when he came in following the scandal, making the point that it's the whole of the business that needs to act with more integrity. It's not just a marketing message. McDonald's had a similar experience as sales declined following increasing concerns about obesity. The instinctive reaction of the business was to throw more dollars at advertising. But of course, this can backfire if the marketing message does not resonate with what your audience believes. It took significant lobbying from the communications team to start changing the culture of the business to become more PR-focused in the true sense of the word, to improve the relationship with the public by listening to their concerns, changing the business as a result, and communicating these changes. From refurbishing the restaurants, better quality locally sourced ingredients, more choice, nice coffee for harassed mums. For communications teams to have this level of responsibility, they need data to support decision-making at a senior level. But often there are barriers to getting this data. For last year's Amex Summit, we did some research amongst 587 PRs, both from in-house teams and from PR agencies. One of the questions we asked was what are the barriers to you adopting analysis? And there were three clear barriers, and they were cost, resource, and complexity. Cost and resource, if you think about it, are really the same thing. We are reluctant to invest. And I think the problem here is because people think they have limited resource, they want to concentrate all of this resource on doing the activity. The irony, of course, is that the best way to make the activity as effective as possible and to make the argument for more budget and resource is to sacrifice a proportion of this towards measurement rather than doing. This is what the American statistician W. Edwards Deming, the father of the business quality movement, and the man who did most to kickstart the Japanese economic miracle in the 50s and 60s, suggested with his proposed PDCA cycle, plan, do, check, act. By earmarking time for planning and measurement, the checking, and acting on the learnings, you maximize the effectiveness of the do. But what about that third point? What about complexity? There is a perception that analysis is confusing and complicated, but it doesn't need to be. It is not rocket science. Actually, speaking of rocket science, this is a picture of my dad, who kind of qualifies as a rocket scientist, as in the early 70s he was a physicist working for NASA. In later life, he went up through the ranks in various computer companies before being the European VP for marketing for HP, Hewlett-Packard. So if you think about it, he's uniquely positioned to know whether measuring marketing communications is rocket science. He assures me it isn't. Actually, in many ways, it is harder than rocket science because we're trying to understand the aggregated effects of thousands of individuals being exposed to thousands of words and pictures across many channels of media. To bring it back to my road trip analogy, it's a bit like trying to navigate your way across a continent by looking at a high-level satellite image. Whereas what you need is a simplified way of viewing the terrain that points out the important things, like roads, in other words, a map, and that plots you a route so that you can get where you want to go. And this brings a fundamental point about what effective analysis looks like. Because analysis often is used as a retrospective exercise, looking back in the rear-view mirror to show how successful we have been. But this misses out on a key benefit. If we're always looking back, we don't know where we're going. And like Thelma and Louise, that's what gets us into trouble. For analysis to be truly effective, it needs to generate insights that can be fed into the planning process so that we are looking forward to understand how we can be more effective over time. Now, if we're looking forward, we need to understand where we want to get to. So the single most important piece of advice in how you should go about building an effective analysis program is to be very clear about your objectives and to build the measurement around these objectives. In 2010, Amex declared a set of 7 principles at the International Measurement Summit in Barcelona. These Barcelona Principles were updated and relaunched during Measurement Month at the end of last year. While much has changed in the media landscape and marketing and communications in the last 5 years, the importance of measurement and goal setting is still seen as the #1 principle. Now, we'll look more in detail at the Barcelona Principles and how they should be used in practice over the next 2 webinars. But for now, let's focus on objectives and goal setting. How do you go about building measurement around your goals? Now, at Gorkana, we use a measurement framework to design our clients' measurement programs. That framework looks like this. We begin by asking what are the overall objectives of the organization, and then how the communications objectives support these overall organizational objectives. And if your team has spent time building a strategic communications plan, this is generally where you start. We need to understand who our target audiences are. What do they currently think about us? What do we want them to think about us? What does good look like? often useful to measure and establish benchmarks so that if you want to improve, you at least know your starting point. We then ask how these strategic objectives translate into the tactics of specific PR and communications activity. So what does the PR plan look like over the coming year? What campaigns are being planned? What events, press releases, interviews, content are going to be produced? And in addition, what are the specific media channels and key influencers we want to get to? Who do we want to target in order to reach our target audiences? We then move on to output metrics. These are the metrics that measure the earned media coverage generated as a result of our activity. This is what most measurement activity tends to focus on, but it's really important that the right output metrics are chosen carefully. Now, we usually recommend a balance of 3 types of output metrics. All too often, people default to basic quantitative metrics, such as the overall volume of coverage, the number of impressions, or even, unfortunately, an advertising value equivalent, or AVE. All of these are big numbers that may sound impressive, but they don't give us a great deal of either meaning or insight. We may have generated a lot of coverage, but what if that coverage was negative or off-message or only featured our brand in a passing mention? So it's important to balance the quantity of coverage with measures that reflect the quality. Now, we may have generated a lot of coverage, and it might have said the right things, but if it appears in publications that were not read by our target audience, then it won't have had much effect. Therefore, we recommend introducing a third category of metrics that indicate whether the media outputs have targeted our key audience. Now, next week, we'll look in more detail about how to identify the most appropriate metrics in each of those categories. Given that for the past 2 decades, an entire industry has grown around measuring outputs, it's worth spending a few minutes looking under the hood to understand how this part of the process works. In order to get our output metrics, we usually have to go through 4 stages, which begins with sourcing the coverage in the first place. Now, a lot of people don't pay much attention to this, but it's really important to get this piece right, otherwise there'll be problems further down the line. I will illustrate this with a war story. In the Second World War, the US Air Force were worried about mounting plane losses as the war in the Pacific continued. To protect planes, they could use armor plating, but they had a challenge because they had to use it sparingly, otherwise the planes would weigh too much to fly. So the key question was, where should you put the armor? So they decided to take a scientific approach by studying where there were the most bullet holes. These tended to be in the fuselage and wings. So a consensus was to concentrate the armor there. Now that was until the statistician Abraham Vold pointed out that they had only taken data from the planes that had returned. What about the ones that hadn't? Presumably these were the ones that had had fatal strikes. So in other words, the armor shouldn't go where there were most bullet holes, they should go where there were least. So the important point here is that the sample of planes was not representative. And this is a challenge that affects sampling in all forms of research. In the last UK general election, the polls predicted the wrong result. A review into how the polling companies worked concluded that the panels that they had recruited systematically had too many Labour voters and too few Conservative voters, which led to the inaccurate predictions. And indeed, we're seeing it now in the run-up to the UK's referendum on the membership of the European Union. There are similar concerns. Are online polls more representative than telephone polls, and vice versa? The debate goes on and on. So when it comes to measuring editorial content, it's extremely important that we're measuring the right content. If you get the sourcing wrong, it doesn't matter how good the analysis is, it will be flawed. And yet all too often, people don't always think about how to get the right content, often relying on automated searches across incomplete content sets. So we spend a lot of time making sure that this part is optimized. What channels do we want to capture? Print, broadcast, online? Do we want to include social media? What countries do we want to capture coverage from? Do we just want to monitor coverage that mentions our organization's brands, or do we want to broaden it out to look at competitor sets so we can set benchmarks, or do we want to look more broadly at industry topics or issues? Once we capture the content, we then need to code it for the relevant output metrics, such as sentiment or key message delivery. And here we have a choice. We can choose between using human coders or whether we want to use automation. Now, there's often a trade-off between quality and cost. Using humans to code articles is generally more accurate and nuanced, but it costs more. It's really important to appreciate this doesn't have to be an either-or. It often makes sense to get a blend of both. For example, it is often desirable to make sure that priority media, so that front page in the Financial Times or Wall Street Journal, is coded as accurately as possible. But it makes less sense to apply human coding to the long tail of social media posts where you might have thousands and thousands, and where automated tools can be directionally correct and significantly more cost-effective. So, where have we got to so far? We've captured the content, we've coded it, but what do we have? We have a load of data that's not really telling us a lot. We have a lot of noise. As the statistician Nate Silver put it, we're not that much smarter than we used to be, even though we have much more information. And that means the real skill now is learning how to pick out the useful information from all this noise. So how do we get useful information? Well, we need to aggregate our data into the right output metrics. We've already touched on this a little bit, but an important question is, what does success look like? To answer this, we need to first choose metrics that are aligned to our overall objectives. Second, it is often useful to identify benchmarks in order to set the bar that allows us to compare our performance. Now, there are a number of ways of doing this. These could be competitive benchmarks, when we compare our organization against others. Alternatively, we can use normative benchmarks, which would allow a comparison over time, for example, month to month, year to year, or campaign to campaign. Finally, we can then draw out insight that enables us to identify what worked, what hasn't, and importantly, what we can do about it, so we can feed this into future planning. Output metrics, while very useful, have a limit. They tell you how much coverage you've generated. They can say whether it said the right thing. They can also say whether it was targeted at your audience. But there is a big so what factor here. What it won't tell you is whether your audience has been affected as a result, and what are the resulting benefits to the organization. And the best analysis features not only media outputs, but how this in turn affects audience outcomes. Ultimately, communications is about creating a dialogue that changes beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors in who we're communicating to. So outcomes is that last piece of our framework. Has our campaign increased awareness about our new product? Are people engaging with us? And ultimately, has it affected sales? What's the impact on our audience? What is the impact on our business? Only when we have done this are we able to show whether we've achieved our objectives and learnt what we can do to improve things over time. Now, what I'd like to do is to illustrate how this framework works in practice by taking you through some examples. But, unfortunately, time is against us. We can't do this today, so we'll have to wait until next week, which tees me up nicely to discuss what we're going to do next week. Next week's webinar, we'll take some of these concepts and explore them further. We'll be looking in more detail at how the Barcelona Principles have created a consensus around what best practice looks like. We'll look at this measurement framework and we'll show how it can and has worked in the real world, bring it to life with some award-winning case studies. Until then, thanks for your time. I hope you found this useful so far. I'm now going to hand back to Philip, who hopefully should have been seeing what questions have been coming through.
Excellent. Thank you, Paul, and thank you so much for that presentation. And like everyone else, I'll be looking very much forward to the second presentation in the series next week. We do have some questions coming in, and I would urge you that we've got a good 10 minutes or so to tackle these questions. So please do take the chance, if you haven't yet, to send in your questions using the box on the right-hand side of the screen. I'm going to start, though, with a question from myself for you, Paul, and that is that you talked about the changing patterns of media consumption and actually increased complexity, as we all know that media channels have proliferated. There are more brands, there are more ways of consuming media, and people are spending more time consuming media. When you have this in mind and you're looking at measurement, how can you future-proof? So this clearly is a trend that's going to get bigger and bigger. There is going to be more media, it's going to be more fragmented. Do you have any principles or any guides in your mind where you say, actually, we need to bear this in mind because this is only going to get more and more complex as we go forward?
I think, in a sense, this relates to the whole concept of analysis rather than monitoring. Mm-hmm. So I think if you think about the way PRs generally used to work, there used to be a reliance on the journalist black book. Here are my set of 20 journalists that I knew and I'd form a relationship with, and if I only really needed to deal with those journalists. and I could rely on a monitoring service, and I could read my press cuttings in the morning. And that pretty much, I read a few newspapers, and that got me up to speed in terms of what was going on in the industry and about my organisation. And clearly, as we have a fragmentation of media, that means that you need better tools to give you the insight, really to signpost what is important. So yes, it probably is going to get more complicated, but it points to the fact that insight that you get from measurement needs to continue in the same vein, in the sense that you still need to be able to identify who are the most influential people that get through to the target audience, what are the most effective media channels, what are the messages that are coming out in media, what can I learn about what is happening in the broader sector.
Great, thank you. We've got some questions. The questions are flooding through now, actually, but I would urge people to keep sending their questions in. I'll ask you this question now, which has been sent in. And Paul, the question is, why do you think PR agencies are so reluctant to adopting analysis, stroke metrics, and are still sticking to the traditional clippings and number of coverages? Do you think that PR agencies are stuck in their old ways?
Very interesting question. I think that's an overgeneralization. I actually see almost two types of response to this challenge. What's interesting is within Amex, we see a real growth in membership from PR agencies. So PR agencies, certainly larger PR agencies, are getting much more involved in measurement. In fact, many have measurement divisions of themselves. And so they are taking measurement very seriously. I think where I see a reluctance, it is in agencies that do analysis for one reason, and that reason is self-justification. So in other words, it's to say, well, look, this is what we've done, and we're effective as a result of it. Please, can we have some budget? Whereas that's only half of the picture. The other half of the picture is you genuinely get insight. Back to the previous question on it's a complicated landscape, so let's make sense of it. And I think when you have that mindset, then it becomes much harder to say that you're not going to invest in it. I also think that point I was making earlier on in the webinar around wanting to concentrate all your resources on the do rather than the checking and the acting on the checking plays a part here as well.
Great. Another question for you, and I think this one looks at AVEs, which I know is something that we really are very very sceptical of, and the question picks up on this. So Paul, the question is, you seemed sceptical of AVE earlier, but how do you satisfy a board of directors who ultimately sign off the PR budget, who only respond to big numbers?
It's a really important question, this, and I think it's interesting to see this debate in the industry, because we'll look at this in more detail in the next two webinars, but one of the Barcelona Principles is that AVEs should not be used to measure the value of communication. And there is an increasing consensus that AVEs are a flawed way of doing that. But what it does, it leaves this gaping hole behind it in terms of, well, if you don't use AVEs, what should you use? So let me, rather than answering that question directly now, let me use it as a plug for the next two webinars, particularly the third webinar, when we're going to look in a lot of detail about measurement of return on investment and proving business value.
Great. So do look out for that. Someone has suggested an answer, actually. Well, in fact, someone has sent in an agreement, which is just simply, thank you very much for this, down with AVE, was one comment. And the other question, which again I think we'll come back to, is do you feel that VMMs will become the new AVEs? But let's move on. In terms of another question, how about this one? And this is about tools. How can you sell an analytics tool to a client who already has a resource in place for metrics? So Paul, is there something in terms of compatibility there of tools and systems?
Potentially. I'm not sure it's a case of which tool you use and who you use as a matter of how it's designed. And this is the big one I think I'm alluding to with the measurement framework, and what we'll look at in much more detail next week with some examples around how you design the measurement program and what metrics you should apply and how you should present those metrics.
I know we're giving a lot of plugs for next week, but that's the reason why we've got a series. And I'm particularly interested because one of the case studies that we'll be looking at in the second webinar is with the Stroke Association. And actually, we've got a question here which is about the charities and the charitable sector. So this question, and bear with me, it's a slightly long one, but it's a really good question. So Paul, this is someone who writes in and says, I work for a charity where much of the PR is based around trying to influence particular organisations, e.g. regulators, government departments. Ultimately, if we achieve the policy change we want, we've been successful, but this is a complex process. So how can you measure influence, or sometimes do you have to accept that you can't know the impact, but that the work is worthwhile?
Yes, it's a specific point now, but it actually raises a much more general point, and the one we'll come to in the third webinar particularly, which is around building a set of evidence points that gives you confidence that what the activity you're doing actually has an effect. And I think what we find is that it's not necessarily one piece of information or one piece of research that proves it. It is a whole series of data points that all collaborate with each other. So in this instance, it might be around, well, we're trying to influence certain types of organizations and individuals. We know, for example, in media coverage, what coverage we generated, we know which publications it's appeared in, so we know it's likely to have been seen by that audience. We could follow up with research, market research, for example, amongst that audience to understand uptake, and obviously you can then follow that through to a policy change as well. So it's a case of building a series of stepping stones to take you in that direction, if that makes sense.
Excellent, and do let us know if that helps you with the answer. And again, I recommend you do listen in to the second webinar in this series next week, and I'll give you the date and details when we wrap up in this webinar. Now, there's a question about inputs really, and I think this may be looking at monitoring. But the question, Paul, is: does it make sense to partner with a set of competitors to agree on the inputs and develop some scale?
I'm trying to understand what that actually relates to. There's a point around collaboration. Yeah, no, I get what this is. Yes. No, so in other words, if I am a bank, retail bank, for example, and one of the things I want to know is how well am I doing against my peers, and other retail banks. One way of doing that is to say, well, actually, there's mutual benefits from us all collaborating here and actually understanding how our sector operates as a whole and setting some benchmarks, and then we can all individually measure ourselves against that. And certainly that has been an approach I've seen in the past. Some sectors do that, and a number of measurement companies produce sector benchmarking as well. So it is, and the challenge you have when you have to collaborate with competitors is that you need everyone to participate for that to happen. So it's one of the things that it's quite ideological. It's often harder to do in practice.
Easier said than done, then. We've got a question here about metrics, and in this case, the question is: one of our metrics is positivity. How can we measure and demonstrate our impact on positivity when there are so many other factors, such as products we launch, etc.?
So, sentiment or favourability or positivity, I'm presuming, is one and the same thing. There are clearly a number of factors that can cause it. What we often do with certainly more complex organisations is we measure this at multiple levels. So if you're a big computer company and you've got multiple products, software products, for example, you might want to measure the sentiment against each of those products. So and then actually within each product, understand the sentiment against different attributes, which might be cost or speed or efficiency or user friendliness. How that contributes to a whole for the product, and then how all the products contribute to the overall brand. So it's really a case of analysis working at multiple levels. My big recommendation there is that to make sure that it all wraps together at a overall organizational strategic level. What I've found in many cases, certainly with larger organizations, that people go off and do their own measurement on their own specific bit, and that relates to their own activity, but nothing really ties it together. So there's nothing that really, there's no kind of overall insight for the business in terms of the broader direction that the comms team and actually the organization itself is traveling in.
Great. We've had a lot of questions about material that we'll make available after this podcast, and we will of course make the slides available. We will have a recording available, and we are actually putting the insights from this series together in a white paper or an ebook if you prefer, which we'll also make available in time for the Amex Summit in the middle of June. So do look out for those. We've also got some great comments coming in, so I thought you'd like to hear this one, Paul. By the way, just also wanted to say Amex framework for measuring social media is also great, so I thought you'd like to hear that. Now, there's some questions about internal comms and I think stakeholder management internally, which we'll come on to in a second. But I thought the first question maybe to put to you now is, how do you approach the subjective nature of qualitative measurement? Because you did mention that people tended to default to just looking at the numbers and quantitative data. So I think that's an interesting question. How do you approach the subjective nature of qualitative measurement?
Yes, I think there's a couple of points there. First is, one of the points I was making earlier on was this choice between using humans and automation. And one of the challenges, I think, automation is very good at quantifying things. How many articles have we had? What are the overall, I guess, the reach of the coverage, and dividing media into media types and all that kind of stuff. It's a lot harder at measuring the qualitative metrics, so for example sentiment or tone or delivery of fairly nuanced messages. So that's where you probably want to use human coding. The challenge with human coding is you might show the same article to 3 different people and you end up with 3 different answers. So there are things you can do to reduce the subjective errors. We actually used 3 ways of doing this within Gorkana. The first is that we take a great store about the brief we agree with clients. So we look at examples of types of articles that deliver different messages, and we agree with the client and ourselves how messages should be delivered, for example, and whether we should treat it as an inference rather than the exact words being mentioned, and how broadly or narrowly we should analyze it. So I think getting the brief right is important. The second thing we do is to make sure that when we are have many analysts, so our bigger analysis programs tend to have multiple analysts coding the articles, that we benchmark those analysts with the same piece of coverage to make sure they're all analyzing it in the same way, so to make sure that they're being consistent. And the third way is actually the system we use, for example, to measure sentiment, rather than measuring the sentiment on a whole article, which produces subjective errors, we actually break the article down into smaller elements, which technically are called context units. They're typically a paragraph. And you assess the favorability of each paragraph, effectively, which is a lot easier to make a decision on a paragraph than is over the whole article. And then you bring each of those context units back together again to assess the overall favorability. And that's been shown both with ourselves and actually academically to reduce those subjective errors. So there's a number of ways you can approach it.
Great. I hope you found that useful. We're going to keep talking for another 5-10 minutes or so. There's still some excellent questions here we're going to get to and talk about. First of all, I mentioned that there have been some questions sent in about sort of almost internal stakeholder management, and I think there's some interesting ones here that go on and look at different aspects of that. So first of all, here's a question for you, Paul. How do you deal with senior management that are fixated on vanity metrics versus impact on an organization?
Well, I think it depends on what you mean by vanity metrics. I think what senior management are generally interested in is what is the impact on the business. And I think the challenge a lot of communicators have is that the numbers that they generate, so let's take an AVE, for example. You know, a comms team might say, well, look, this is the value of what we produce in the form of an AVE, and they'll send it to, you know, upwards in the chain. Now, at the end of the day, an AVE is how much this would have cost if it was advertising. So it's not actually showing any kind of business impact at all. It's just saying this is what it would have cost if we did something that we didn't do. So there's actually a disconnect, I think, between some of these quantitative numbers that go up and a genuine understanding of how that then impacts the organization. And I think it's this point around, it's this framework point around building these evidential points that we have an organizational strategy, we have a communication strategy, we then do the do, we then measure what's outputted in the media, we then understand how that's affected our stakeholders that are interested in, and then we understand how that in turn has driven business results. And it's that you almost need to educate, I think, senior executives on the journey that someone takes. What's kind of interesting is that marketing has a similar challenge, but often doesn't have necessarily the same problems with getting that kind of airplay in senior management. Certainly doesn't have problems in securing large budgets.
Absolutely. Now, there's an international dimension to this next question, which touches on a similar point, but use an example of a Hong Kong-based company. So, Paul, the question is, I used to work for a Hong Kong-based company a few years ago, and they were only interested in numbers, not quality. Do you see any change in the attitude towards ways of measuring, such as more meaningful analysis rather than just quantity, on an international level too, or is this is this more a UK thing?
I think it does vary market to market, but broadly there is a global trend in this direction. What's interesting, again, from an Amex membership point of view, is that a lot of new members come from various parts of the world. It's not just UK or Europe. There's a lot of Asia-Pacific organizations. There are lots from North America, and I was on a membership call with an agency that came from South America, from Ecuador. So organizations from all around the world are getting us on this program of what our best practice looks like.
Excellent. Now, there's a question here, and certainly I don't see it this way, but so it refers to PRs looking at measurement as a dark art. So I'll be interested to see how you handle this one, Paul. The question is, a lot of PRs seem to see measurement as a dark art, and there's a reluctance to commit to meaningful measurement and analysis. Why is there this fear factor? Do PRs genuinely not understand why they are doing the work that they do? So do you think there is a fear factor about measurement, and that's one of those barriers that you talked about to implementation?
Yes, I think that. Well, I think there's a fear factor in measurement for those that haven't done it before. I think when people do measurement, they then, they become converted. I think one of the challenges with something I'm very passionate about, and I think I do this alluding back to the fact that my dad was this NASA scientist, and my mum was a physicist. I did physics at university, and I'm a physicist, son of two physicists. And I felt very alone in the PR industry. There aren't a huge number of people with a kind of scientific or numerate background. Media is enormous, as we talked about earlier on. I think the challenge is if the PR industry doesn't take advantage of it, then other parts of the marketing industry and actually broader management consultancy, who, let's face it, generally are more numerate and more au fait with measurement, will. So I think there's actually a genuine wake-up call that if you can't really hide behind the fact that it is an art and not a science. In fact, I heard someone describe PR measurement as the science behind the art. So I mean, it clearly is a blend. You know, you have to see some fantastic creative processes behind PR and the internet, some fantastic creative ideas, but unless those creative ideas actually help drive the bottom line for businesses, there is an ongoing challenge.
Thank you so much, everyone, for sending in your questions. I'm going to finish with one question now for Paul about social media. And I know it's always dangerous to generalize, but if we'd been running this webinar 10 years ago, social media wouldn't be the factor in people's media programs and their measurement that it is today. And I'm interested, Paul, in terms of what you see as social media having brought to this table. Is it just an added layer of complexity? You mentioned, for instance, sometimes there's noise in terms of measurement and that there are things that really you should be ignoring. Is there a tendency for activity on social media to just be noise as well? What do you see that the one thing that social media has changed about this process and that you know has made things different now?
Am I allowed to?
You are allowed to.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think there are two important points on the social media side. One is that the sheer volume of social media forces the hand. Because of this complexity, because of the increased numbers, it forces the need for signposting what's important, which is what analysis is. So in a sense, what was quite useful in mainstream media becomes essential in social media. And certainly when you combine the two, then it becomes really important. One of the things I think is really worth stating, actually I'm now coming to 3 points, but
I'll allow you 3.
One of the things that I think is really worth stating, this is one of the Barcelona Principles, is I think one of the challenges with social media is that people then go and measure it in a siloed way. They go and measure it separately from how they're measuring more mainstream media. And of course that doesn't help, because more often than not it's how the two interact with each other and how mainstream media drives social media, but also social media drives journalists' agendas as well, so it works in both ways. To understand how that ebbs and flows is really important in terms of management, particularly in terms of managing a crisis as well as promoting a new thing. So I think that's point. The second point I was going to make earlier on was around listening. So I think the other thing that social media brings is that it allows us to listen to the effect that our communications is having. And I think one of the challenges we have as communicators is that we tend to think about communications as a one-way channel. Yeah, we launch a press release, we run an event, and therefore we still want to see what journalists are saying and how that's gone out to the public. Not always thinking, well, what's the public's reaction to what they're saying? It's a bit like the McDonald's example. If we can't advertise our way out of trouble if the audience doesn't believe what we're saying. So social media allows us often a very convenient way of listening to the reaction to the public that we're interested in. But a word of warning, back to our bullet holes example, it's often it's not necessarily a representative sample of who we're trying to influence.
So you may be hearing from the people that you aren't particularly wanting to target, and that can sometimes be the noise.
Yeah, or it's ones that with very strong opinions are the ones that voice them.
Of course.
Miss the silent majority.
Of course. And actually, on that note, I want to thank the silent majority on today's webinar. Thank you so much, everyone, for taking part and listening in. I want to thank in particular the people who sent in questions. They've been brilliant questions. If you didn't get the answers you wanted, though, I do recommend that you come to the second webinar and continue the debate with us. I shall give you the details on that in a minute. Before I do that, though, I do want to say a very big thank you to Paul Hender and say thank you so much for that presentation. And I look forward to hearing how the road trip continues in the second and third webinar of this series. So I'll finish with a reminder that the next webinar in the series is on the 1st of June. We'll be looking at measurement, best practice, and successful case studies. And as I've mentioned, we'll be looking at the Stroke Association and the work that Gorkana has done with them, and much more. I do hope that you can join us. See you soon. The webinar is now over.